our community partners for today's program, the Western Reserve Land Conservancy and Bike Cleveland. There's information outside about both entities if you're interested. We encourage you to find out more. Lastly, the second half of the program is a Q&A with all of you. That's when you get to ask the questions. Our staff will bring the wireless handheld microphones out to you, and they'll hold on to the microphone for you, so you don't have to worry about that. You can just focus on asking your question and making it brief. A couple of other things, too. We do have cameras in the room, so we are recording for broadcast, and we are going to be live on the radio, too, starting at 12:30. But that's a officially a legal disclaimer that we all just did there. So if you don't want to participate in the broadcast, I'm sorry, too bad. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. You have until then, if there's anybody at your table you haven't yet introduced yourself to, please fix that. Thanks so much.
You get yelled at by the director if the microphones don't work out.
We do. Okay. We're relying on you to stick this on yourself.
The mic will look good. I'm not sure I will, but
Too late for that.
We can't help you. I don't know if you can Photoshop on like a broadcast.
Oh, that's right. You were in the bow tie. You're too sharp for these.
that's all right. I do it like this.
Probably gonna be.
You're from Akron, aren't you, sir? Yes. I just went to the Greater Akron Chamber of Commerce meeting this morning. Yeah, I hope you had a good visit. Yeah, I just might join it. Is it a diverse community, Akron?
It is. It is very much.
Because I work for an immigration law.
And we've actually done quite a bit of work with the International Institute of Akron, and we've got in the North Pole neighborhood a really large and growing Bhutanese, Nepalese, and Burmese population. So I'm hoping we actually get more immigrants in.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
sir.
thank you.
I know you're going to do well today.
Hey, thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Jason Russell, City Planner for the City of Lakewood. I'm pleased to be here today to moderate this conversation on the future of transportation in Northeast Ohio. It's no secret that here in Northeast Ohio, our population trends haven't always aligned with our transportation planning. Between 1970 and 2010, our region's population declined by more than 7%. In the same time period, we grew by 250 square miles of suburban development. That's an increase of 21%. Now that increase in development required new roads. In fact, we built 300 miles of additional highway lanes since the 1990s. Now road maintenance, of course, isn't cheap, and local leaders estimate that nearly $300 million in immediate resurfacing needs are needed in the city of Cleveland alone. Now, fixing all of Northeast Ohio's roads is not going to happen in the next hour, but here's what we are going to do today. Our panelists are two leaders in community and transportation planning, and we're going to discuss a few items, including preserving and enhancing our existing infrastructure, correcting the impact of past decisions, and planning for sustainability and growth in our region. And with that, let me introduce our panelists. To my immediate left, I have Grace Gallucci. She's the Executive Director of the Northeast Ohio Areawide Coordinating Agency, the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Cuyahoga and surrounding counties. For short, we're going to call it NOACA, okay? To my further left, I have Jason Segedy, who's the Director of Planning and Urban Development for the City of Akron. Most recently, he served as Grace's counterpart for the Akron-based Metropolitan Planning Organization, AMATS. So with that out of the way, I'd love to get started. My first question I'm going to have for both of you. I recently just spoke about the immediate needs for resurfacing in the city of Cleveland alone. But can you guys speak to how your agencies are working to address the backlog in transportation resurfacing needs?
I can start, but before I get to your question, I would like to thank the Ronis family for sponsoring this event. Leonard Ronis was a special person to me. He was a friend and a mentor for many years. There are two things that Leonard really loved. One was transportation, and the other was the City Club. He and I would meet here at least once a month for several years while he mentored me. And I was one of the groupies that followed him around at the APTA conferences. That is how I got to know Leonard Ronis. Also, I'd like to acknowledge my board president, Lorain County Commissioner Ted Kalo, and my incoming board president, Lake County Commissioner Dan Troy. So, how do we do it? So how are we now looking to resolve the issue of the backlog of projects? We're never going to be able to resolve it entirely unless we have additional funding. So certainly on one side of the equation or the formula for that kind of work and that kind of success is to continually seek ways to increase the funding in a way that's balanced, equitable, and rational. But considering that we're talking politics here, we'll put that aside for the moment and focus on the more practical side of dealing with the existing resources. The NOACA board has been extremely progressive, and they have developed a methodology whereby a committee structure exists that we look at objective criteria and assess from a very pragmatic perspective how we want to allocate the resources. We are looking at, we've implemented and are looking towards the completion of an asset management program that is currently assessing the inventory of all the roads in the region across all our 5 counties. We are looking at the condition of those roads. Then we are looking at all of the other important aspects of the roads that require us to think about how to improve mobility. We're putting all that together in a technology-based tool that will help us to make those decisions, and then layering that with community engagement and so on. Our first piece of that is the road network. Our next piece of that will be the transit network. So that's how we're approaching it.
And Jason, can you speak to your previous role at AMATS, how your agency was taking?
Absolutely, and I was just going to add to that. Jason had mentioned this, but this is day 5 on the job for me as Akron's new Director of Planning and Urban Development, and I'm very happy to be here and not be sitting around a conference room table right now. So, and if you'll indulge me, I will probably shift back and forth between the hat that I wore up through last Friday and the hat that I'm wearing now. So, in our Metropolitan Planning Organization in Akron, we made a very intentional effort to prioritize resurfacing roads and fixing bridges specifically. As was mentioned in the lead-in,
we very much were cognizant of the fact that in our region, and this would include all of Northeast Ohio, we're a negative growth region. So not only are our cities not growing, but our region overall is shrinking. And we made a very deliberate decision that it just simply didn't make sense from the funding that our agency controlled to continue to put funding into adding more and more lanes to roadways. Just some context though, our agency directly controlled around $15 million a year in federal transportation funds. There are projects that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. So there are lots of other funding sources that we didn't control, but with those that we did control, our members collectively in Summit and Portage County felt like resurfacing roads was our priority. So that's what we did. I think in the last fiscal year, 7% of our funds went into expanding highways. The other 93% either went to maintenance or public transit. We even have a project in Akron right now, maybe I'll talk about this on another question, where we're actually deconstructing 1 mile of freeway. So we're taking our Interbelt Freeway in the core of the city, which carries about a fifth of the traffic that it was designed for. We're decommissioning it. Eventually, parts of it will get torn out, and we'll be freeing up 30 acres of land for redevelopment. So I think that's just indicative of the fact not only are we having to maintain what we have, but we're also at the point where, at least in our cities, in some cases we don't even need the transportation capacity that we have. The Interbelt was also a maintenance issue, so it was going to cost us a lot of money to resurface that road, fix these bridges. We didn't think it made fiscal sense to do that.
Sure. And we've just recently been speaking about fixing and repairing what we have, and I think I speak for many in the room, it'd be a shame if we just fixed it as is. Is there an opportunity to make it different? I think when we look at our own houses and we go to paint a wall, we think, well, maybe I'll try a different paint color this time. And so when your agencies are thinking about redoing roads, are you thinking about perhaps creating more balance in our transportation network and providing different opportunities for other modes of transit?
Absolutely. One of the advantages of having a well-built-out system, or in the case of Northeast Ohio, probably an overbuilt system, is that it leaves us a lot of opportunity for when we want to include other modes of transportation. There generally is the room to do that. One of the ways that we're kind of working with folks in the community to accomplish that is through our Transportation for Livable Communities Initiative grants. And we are actually working with folks to take some roadways that we're looking at maintaining, and because they are larger than is currently required for the vehicle miles traveled, we're looking at adding bicycle lanes or center medians for a walkable and bikeable trail. So there are ways that we are looking at making the maintenance of the existing system not only a maintenance project but an enhancement project as well.
And I would just add, I think when you're talking about transportation choice, it's very critical to not make false choices about it. So what I mean by that is, I think often when people talk about, especially when there's competing, because like every other endeavor of life that involves money, which is most of them, they're competing priorities, and there are a lot of debates in the transportation community about how much funding goes to roads versus public transit versus bike trails, et cetera. But I think the false choice that I've always tried to reject is the idea that it has to be either or. And especially in a region like Northeast Ohio, I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't already know, but it is unlikely that you will live car-free wherever you live if it's of your own free choice, because we do need cars to get around, primarily in this region. However, there are lots of folks that don't have cars, partly due to economic circumstances. We can't forget about them. But even more importantly, I think it's the idea that you could still, depending on where you live, have more options if the infrastructure were in place and the land use were such that would allow you to do that. So one thing in Akron, we started a couple years ago putting bike racks on our Metro RTA buses. When that was first proposed, lots of people said, that's crazy, who's ever going to put a bike on a bus and ride it around? Of course, almost anyone who would make that critique would never have any intention of putting a bike on a bus themselves, and that's fine, but they weren't putting themselves in the shoes of people that might want to do that. Well, a couple years later now, we're transporting 15,000 bikes a year on Metro buses, and all of the buses have bike racks now. And because there are a lot of folks without a car, that they get around by the bus, and they need, a bike is faster than walking, and if you can bike, you'll do it. So similarly, I just think in neighborhoods, being able to have the option to walk to something. So for me, it's not so much about this false choice between live without a car like you're in New York City or drive everywhere all the time. I mean, just one other thought on that. I think in our region, there's a lot of promise in the idea that you would just drive less. So it's not that you would quit driving or you would abandon your car, but all things being equal, if the store is a mile away rather than 5 miles away, that's an easy bike ride. You might even walk if it's a nice day. So I think it's about creating more choices and not limiting one or the other.
Right. Jason, I'm glad you brought up the idea of public transit and serving those who don't have access to a vehicle, because we primarily talked about preserving infrastructure for automobiles, but we're talking about preserving and enhancing, and frankly in recent years it's been sort of a struggle to even preserve the quality of service for public transit, primarily through financial reasons. So how can we work as a region to not only preserve our quality of public transit now, but also enhance access for others through public transit?
I mean, first I'll say something that Joe Calabrese says all the time. Buses ride on the roads, so there's really not a distinction between the work that we do in creating and maintaining the roads and the access to public transit. And again, gives us opportunities to do things like bus priority lanes or et cetera. So we're looking at it to that end. And I'm sorry, what was the question?
It's more enhancing. So if we can do more routes to go to different job centers or different timings of that, how can we enhance access? I mean, that's one of the big complaints. I don't take public transit because it takes me so long to get there.
Yeah, that's a challenging issue. It's not something that we can answer in 5 minutes. Clearly, the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority is the strongest transit system in the state of Ohio. It carries more people in the one day that it serves customers in Northeast Ohio than the rest of the state combined. So that's a big deal. We also have other terrific transit systems in the region, like Akron, like Lake County. We've got some in Lorraine, we've got some in Medina, Brunswick. So we have the networks here. And when you're talking about people getting to jobs and getting to doctors, getting to schools, and what that means, I like to say transportation is the ticket out of poverty. That is how we allow people to get initially to their education, to allow their families to thrive, to live in ways, as Jason said, that gives people choices. And I think that's what we're talking about. And public transit needs to be more than a thought of transportation is for people who don't have cars, or transportation or public transportation are for people who are poor. Public transportation is one way, one mode of getting around. It is one choice that we can make to move ourselves. It's a mobility option and needs to be thought of in that way. And only in that way can we make it stronger. If we're constantly thinking of public transit as a social service, it will always be marginalized and it will be looked at in a different way. We need to optimize our transportation system in its entirety, which means all modes: automobile, public transit, walking, and biking. And when you use them all together, that's what the answer is.
Excellent. Now, and Jason, you had spoken earlier about the Metro and Akron putting in the bike racks. I mean, that alone is enhancing because now you extend the reach of individuals who are using the service.
Absolutely, and that was an example. Not all things, I'll touch on this in a second, are that low cost, but that was a very cost-effective. Yes, bike racks aren't free, but bike racks in the whole scheme of things are not all that expensive, and it really did enhance the quality of transit service for a lot of people. One other point I just wanted to add to augment what Grace said is, I think a lot of the transit access questions actually, maybe somewhat paradoxically, aren't public transportation questions per se. So a lot of them are job location questions. And to give a shout out to my friends at the Fund for Our Economic Future, they've done a lot of work with their growth and opportunity initiative, starting to look at not just things like job training, but where are jobs being located. And I think what we've seen, and this isn't unique to Northeast Ohio, this is nationwide, but it probably is even more apparent here. We've had a large outmigration of jobs, especially lower wage jobs. Often when people talk about jobs, they talk about the type of job they have. So it's very easy for me, if I'm not putting my empathetic shoes on that morning, to think that everyone wears a suit and tie and goes to work the way that I do. There are a lot of different jobs out there, and a lot of those retail jobs especially are very disconnected from where the folks that work at those retail jobs are. That means a longer bus trip, a more inconvenient bus trip. It means difficulty in getting your kids to daycare and then riding the bus. In a lot of cases, it means you can't work there at all because there isn't a bus route, or it's so convoluted and difficult. And that's not Joe Calabrese's fault or anybody at a regional transit authority. It's not necessarily anyone's fault. That's the way it's evolved, but I think we do have to be intentional about the way that we look at job placement and the opportunity, because I think you can make a pretty good economic argument if lower income people can't get to jobs. In Metro RTA in Akron, unlike RTA in Cleveland, which does have a lot more diverse ridership, 90% of our passengers earn under $20,000 a year. So they are very predominantly lower income people that do work, but they make minimum wage. And if they can't get to work, and then we're going to be paying for other benefits socially for them. So I think in the economic calculus, it is very important to take that into account. And although it's easier said than done, I think we need to do a better job as a region about bringing the jobs back to where the people that need them are, rather than bringing the people to those jobs, because it's a lot more expensive to do that.
Sure. Now I want to jump to this idea of sustainability and growth. I mentioned earlier, and we all know that the population in our region has been steadily declining for several decades, but there is, if you really dig down into the numbers, of the demographic numbers, there is growth in certain areas. The baby boomers are aging, oftentimes aging in place. Millennials are growing in number and getting louder about their desires and needs for things. So how are the Metropolitan Planning organizations adapting to these changing demographics? Obviously, seniors have very different needs than Generation Xers have, and millennials. So how are you adapting to rise to the challenge of those changing demographics?
Well, first, we remind ourselves regularly that we are planning for the future. Planning is not about planning for the people that are here today or the world that we lived in yesterday. It's about the future. What's it going to be? What are the needs going to be 10 years, 15, 20, 25 years? And we are constantly looking at that from a very pragmatic perspective relative to the, as you stated, the trends of the population, the demographics, and their desires. Many times it's easy to compare government to private sector, and sometimes it's not easy to compare government to private sectors. But when you're talking about planning and you're thinking about market share, and you're thinking about how do we provide the transportation options and choices for the people who want it, where, when, and how. And a lot of what we do is modeling. We develop ways to assess what the future wants are going to be, and then how to match that with the existing network of transportation, as well as how do we then enhance that or transform that to meet those needs. And that is the essence of what we do in planning.
So Grace, let me give you a specific example just to dig down a little bit deeper. When we talk about seniors aging in place, perfect scenario is individual perhaps lives, I'll say Strongsville, in a cul-de-sac, who now they can't drive anymore, but they still need access to go to the grocery store, go to a doctor's appointment. How do you start to address those things? I mean, millennials have made it very clear that they want bike lanes, make things walkable. I mean, I don't want to make a joke about it, but do we start making wheelchair lanes? Like, how do you address that situation?
Again, how do you address that situation? As Jason said, it's not really just a transportation question. The answer is not put hundreds and hundreds of hours of paratransit service out there to pick everybody up and take them to where they want to go. That's not going to work. It's not economically viable. Nor is it really what I think people want, they don't want to be dependent. And so how do you address that? It is much more of a long-term question, and in terms of aging in place, well, maybe it's not so much aging in place as it is moving to where the community can support those with those kinds of restrictions in mobility. So I think as our community is evolving, the market actually is dictating that there are housing options available that would both allow folks who are aging as well as the millennial generation to get what they want. Actually, those two groups are extremely compatible in the kinds of transportation needs and the offerings that we can provide.
You have thoughts, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think the generational issue is very interesting. I appreciated you throwing Generation X in there because as a Generation Xer, the generation that dare not speak its name, that nobody ever seems to know what it wants. And I think, although there's been a lot of anecdotal talk about what boomers want or what millennials want, and every once in a while what Gen Xers want, I think there is some truth to those overall trends. I mean, it's indisputable demographically that the population's getting older, that the median age in the United States is climbing. It's climbing even faster here. And I think it is equally true that younger people generally are more open to living in cities, participating in cities. Not everyone, to be sure. I think when I think about the future as well, a lot of changes in technology. I mean, Uber didn't exist a couple years ago, and the ability of people to, again, I think it goes back to what I said before, many Uber users do own a car, but often are in situations where they don't want to drive that day or they can't drive that day, or even in a region like ours. So, and who knows what technology is going to bring. There's the idea of self-driving cars. I don't even claim to know enough about what that might do to have an opinion on that, although it kind of creeps me out a little bit. But who knows, I'll probably be in one when they have one. But I think that, you know, the other thing I think about planning for the future is when I look at my own profession, there were a lot of urban planning initiatives that sounded really great at the time, like that Interbelt freeway that we're tearing out in Akron right now. So I do try to interject a dose of humility, hopefully, into the work that we do, that I think it is important that we be somewhat judicious in how we predict trends or respond to the market, because although I think we have to try to come up with ideas and plan for the future, it is our charge. I think making big changes prematurely can be something that 2020 hindsight is a pretty bitter pill to swallow. So.
And Jason, I'm glad you brought up the 2020 hindsight, because one of my questions was, knowing what you know about Northeast Ohio now, if you could go back 50 years, what's something you would change to make the region better today?
I'm going to answer that a little bit differently. 50 years from now, if we can be successful in attracting true growth, not just reshuffling the deck in our region as we've been doing,
Right.
we'll look like geniuses, because what was planned 50 years ago, the overbuilt transportation system and the overbuilt housing that we have, will be what is needed. And that's a realistic premise if you think about the fact that the United States is going to gain 50 million people. There's no reason that Northeast Ohio can't capture a large share of those folks. And so how do we transform the region relative to population and relative to other aspects of growth, true growth, that now conform with the past decisions? So let's not look at what we did perhaps as wrong or as a failure, but as an opportunity to look like we were really smart, and we intended that the entire time.
Sure. And Grace, I think if winters keep up like they have been this winter, we will attract a lot more
Yes.
people. So, Jason, what do you?
You know, I think as far as specifics, the planning idea that I definitely would have changed would have been going back to that Interbelt project again. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but urban renewal. The urban renewal that was done in the 60s and 70s, I think, harmed many communities with maybe good intentions. I'll be generous and say good intentions, but I think it did a lot to hollow out our cities and exacerbated a lot of the trends that were already happening that were pushing people out. Anyway, I think for a big picture trend, I think it was a huge mistake that we at the federal, state, and local government were so, was generous with all of our citizens' money, so I don't know that it was generous, but provided so much infrastructure that back in the Eisenhower era, there was a big debate over whether freeways should be built like the Ohio Turnpike, which predated the interstate system. It became an interstate later. It was completed in 1959. And when it was completed, the idea was freeways would be more like that. It would run between Cleveland and Akron. There would be exits every 12 or 15 miles, but it wasn't necessarily for commuting or your everyday travel. But the faction that wanted to put freeways through the cities won out. And I think that had two horrible outcomes. One is it ripped the cities apart. The second one was it made it very easy to not live in the city anymore. And I would say it's the same story with the provision of utilities. And sometimes I think cities were their greatest enemy with that, because in a lot of cities, the idea was, let's sell water, let's keep building water lines everywhere. We can make money off of this, but I think that proved to be very short-sighted, because yes, you made money off of it, and yes, it caused all of your jobs and people to leave. So I think those types of trends, maybe fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have the money to do that anymore. It's just flat out not going to happen. That was a legacy of the Kennedy era, the Eisenhower era, when the United States was doing very well economically. I think the big challenge now is all of that stuff's already been built. A lot of it hasn't even gotten old yet. What's going to happen to it when it gets old? I'm not very optimistic about us being able to pay even to maintain everything we have, let alone keep building new stuff. And I think especially in a region like ours that isn't growing at all, that's especially problematic.
But I think we're kind of at a point, to Jason's point earlier, that he only controls $15 million, or AMATS only controls $15 million of the transportation dollars in the region. We only control $50 million of transportation funding in the region. There's $2 billion worth of transportation funding in the state of Ohio. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that capacity isn't being increased. It is being increased. It's being increased in our region as well as throughout the state. And if that's something that works with our plan, then that's terrific. If it's not working, and to your point of would we change anything, do we need continual expansion of the highway system? It is being expanded in our own region. That's not a choice that perhaps we specifically make, but it is part of another network, the highway network, the internet, the state as well as the national highway system. How do we want to participate in that?
Well, so I was wondering, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations are very complex. You guys do a lot more things than even what we're talking about today. There's environmental impact that you guys focus on. And we talk about sustainability 50 years from now. Is there a role, do you think, that these MPOs can take on that you don't currently take on today?
I think we can take a larger role in environmental sustainability issues, particularly relative to air quality. And air quality function relates very specifically to our transportation function, but to move even beyond the congestion analysis and to move beyond looking at the impacts of projects and how those impacts will affect air quality, but being much more aggressive and much more overt in how we use the dollars that we get and the influence of how other dollars are spent to mitigate the air quality issues and to transform them. So how do we continue to work towards cleaner air, and what does that mean? And I mean, we would all love to stop e-check, wouldn't we? Wouldn't that be great? We're wanting to work towards that end. How do we clean the air up? We can set goals, we can set targets to change mode shift, or to shift modes, mode share. We can really take up an aggressive campaign on the air quality issue.
I think one of the very wise things about the creation of metropolitan planning organizations, and for those of you, I'm sure there were people that walked in here today and didn't know what a metropolitan planning organization is, and that's not uncommon or anything that you should feel bad about. We are agencies that often are not all that well known, but I think what was very wise is when the statutory authority came from the federal government in 1962 to create them, they were very much created as a way to have a mediator between decisions on federal funding and local officials. So their power is really that they're a table that representatives of all the local governments sit around. The reason I bring up that rather mundane detail about how we're constituted is the local governments have a lot of power if they choose to take it to craft that organization to be the type of organization they want. So although the charge of an MPO is primarily transportation, each MPO is a little bit different. Some MPOs get more involved in economic development, some get involved in regional land use planning, but that's only going to happen if the people in the region collectively want to do that, and then they have a lot of freedom to constitute themselves however they think makes sense. So I think in our region, there aren't a whole lot of other tables in Northeast Ohio where local governments all sit together. And I do think that in the future, it's worth thinking about how better can they organize. The thing I always loved about being at an MPO, and I still really believe now that I'm on the other side of the table, is that the kind of like the phrase "think globally, act locally." It's think regionally, act locally. So the real power of what MPOs can do, I think, is still at the local level, but it's informed by the regional view.
You know, Jason, I want to go back and answer a question that you asked that I didn't really have a good thought on. If I could go back and change something that we did in Northeast Ohio that I think detrimentally affected our overall growth economically, land use-wise, and transportation-wise, I would never let Summit and Portage County out of the NOACA family. We were 7 counties. And the original study in the 60s looked at Northeast Ohio as 7 counties, and Cleveland and Akron areas with all those with all 7 of the counties were the region. We allowed ourselves to be bifurcated for many political and personal reasons, and I think that probably was the beginning of a less regional Northeast Ohio. And I think that's what really got us started onto the track of thinking of our own individual parochial desires as opposed to what's best for the region.
Yeah. But I'm still happy to be here at the city.
And with that, we'll take a brief break while we transition to the audience Q&A. I'm Dan Walthrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club. And today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a panel conversation on transportation in Northeast Ohio and the future of our region, featuring Grace Gallucci, Executive Director of the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency, fondly known as NOACA, and Jason Segedy, Director of Planning and Urban Development for the City of Akron, formerly of AMATS, the Akron Metro Area Transportation Study. Our moderator is Lakewood City Planner and South Euclid Councilman and friend of the City Club, Jason Russell. We encourage you to organize questions for our speakers now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. If you're joining us via our radio broadcast or our web stream and would like to tweet a question, we encourage that. Please tweet it at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via the radio broadcast and web stream, which is provided by our primary media partner, 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Production, distribution, and broadcast of City Club programs are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Next Friday, January 15th, the City Club welcomes the most successful inventors you've never heard of, John Nottingham and Bill Nottingham of Nottingham Spirk, for a conversation on success in innovation and design. For more information about that program or any of our upcoming or past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's forum is the inaugural Leonard Ronis Memorial Forum on Transportation and Planning, made possible by a special gift from members of the Ronis family. We thank you so much for your support. It's an honor. Today's forum is also part of our Local Heroes series, which is sponsored by a generous grant from Dominion. We thank you very much for your support. Our community partners for today's forum include Bike Cleveland, Open NEO, and the Western Reserve Land Conservancy. We thank you for your assistance with today's program. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, the fund for our economic future, Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority, you know it as the RTA, NOACA, and the Ronis family. We thank you all for your support. And now it's time to return to the panel for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, members and guests alike. Holding our microphones today, our content associate Teddy Eisenberg and marketing and outreach fellow Faye Walker. May we have the first question, please?
And we're actually going to kick things off with one of those Twitter questions that Dan just mentioned. Michael Barron is curious for your comments on the Opportunity Corridor and how we might maximize our return on investment from that project.
Jason has done much more blogging and talking on the subject than I have. You know, the Opportunity Corridor is a investment in the region, and there's been a lot of analysis done before my time that I can't really provide too much insight on, but it's an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for the region to put a better connection between 490 and University Circle and to build up the land use in between. So I think it's an opportunity for us. Are there folks who are not supportive of it? Yes, there are folks that are not supportive of it for many reasons, some of which include the questioner's point of economic return. Again, we'll have to wait and see. It can be done really right in where the economic return will be tremendous. The Euclid Corridor, which is now the Health Line, when that was initially being planned, we were looking to invest $200 million, and we had many of the same kinds of naysayers that the Opportunity Corridor has now. It's $200 million that's going to be wasted, or it's $200 million that we'll never get a return on. We've had $7 billion worth of investment along that corridor, much of which can be directly related to that transportation investment. The leveraging of the dollars, you could not find a better return on investment. There would be private sector investors dying to invest in something like this if it were offered. So if it's done right and we are accurately assessing the need and developing what can be developed, taking that opportunity and taking that challenge, hopefully it will exactly be a terrific return on investment.
Jason, I know I've read some of your blogs. I know you're nipping to answer that. So go ahead.
Well, actually, I think in this situation I'm going to render unto Caesar and let Grace address that question.
All right, so we'll move on to our next question.
Yes, I just wanted to know if the panelists could please talk for a second about the importance of public transportation to vulnerable groups like the immigrant community.
Public transportation is important to vulnerable communities, of course, particularly, as you mentioned, immigrants, or as we've talked before, the elderly or the young, the poor. But again, I want to make sure that we're focusing on public transportation as not simply a way for us to address a social service need. It is truly a transportation issue, and it is a mode choice. It is a way to connect or to make the entire transportation system work in a holistic way.
One thing, and I invite all of you to come down to Akron and experience this neighborhood. We have a neighborhood in Akron called North Hill. About 100 years ago, it was full of Italian and Polish immigrants. Today, it's home to over 5,000 Bhutanese, Nepalese, and Burmese immigrants. It's a very interesting thing to behold, the way the immigrants are remaking and renovating and revitalizing that neighborhood, quite honestly taking over spaces that a lot of other people didn't want. There are stores, people are rehabbing houses that you or I probably wouldn't put the money into rehabbing. And one of the big needs in the community, though, is transportation. It's a little bit less of a need because it's very much a traditional immigrant community, the way that immigrant communities were here in Northeast Ohio 100 years ago. So it's very walkable, most of the services that the immigrants need are nearby, but public transit is still a need in that neighborhood, especially to access jobs or opportunities in other parts of the city and the region. Another thing that we're working on in that neighborhood right now is trying to make it more bike friendly and walkable, because that is a population that very much proportionately doesn't have cars. Typically, when the immigrants make enough money, they will get a car, but they'll often share a car between a couple people. But we're getting around 500 to 600 new immigrants every year into that neighborhood through the International Institute in Akron, and so the needs are still there. But I think in the future, with immigration being very high in the United States in general, it hasn't come that much to this region, but if and when it does, I think that is, from a planning perspective, we need to think about the needs of those communities, everything from language to transit and so forth.
You know, I will say that the immigrant aspect of it is unique in a sense that we could use immigrants or immigration to build support for public transit. Typically, immigrants are coming from countries that have a high utilization of public transit. So they come with the expectation that public transit isn't a social service, but it is actually a form of transportation. My parents and grandparents were immigrants, and we did not have a car growing up. My grandparents and parents never bought a car. We went everywhere on the bus. If it wasn't on the bus line, you didn't need to go there. That's what I was told. There was nothing good to come of it. But out of that, public transit for me and for my brothers and sisters, my cousins, became normal. That is part of the transportation equation. Do I have a car now? Of course, I have a convertible. I like to drive too, but I also like taking the train. Living on a train line or bus line is always part of my formula for a housing choice.
Sure. Chris.
If you could change one state policy, what would it be? And could you share with the audience the consequence of that policy that most of us don't ever really realize?
That's a good question.
Have I mentioned that ODOT is my biggest funder? And Jason no longer works in a system where the state is the biggest funder, so he can start.
I can start on that one if you. I think, especially because it is the topic this afternoon, but it is a really important issue, I would change the way that transportation funding is prioritized in the state. So I'm going to cheat and maybe invoke a couple policies here, but I think one is that we kind of alluded to it in the earlier conversation about prioritizing funding and building new stuff, so to speak. Well, there are some needs for new highway capacity. I mean, Columbus is growing. I think that should be something that we all wish was here instead in Northeast Ohio, and maybe it'll come back. But in our region, we really don't need that new highway capacity. When we're widening 271, when we're widening I-77 and I-76, I don't think enough thought or time has been put into questioning, do we really need to do that? What's the return on investment? And it really comes down to things like, is saving 50,000 people every day, literally 3 minutes of travel time or 2 minutes, is it worth spending $250 million for? And it's also $250 million that has a big opportunity cost that we could be spending on something else. So I'm not saying, and we didn't do this at AMATS when I worked there, we didn't say we will never ever spend a dime on adding lanes to something, but we were very judicious about how we spent that money. And I think and that might be where the role of a region has to come in, because I think the state is largely going to respect and cater to the wishes of the constituents. So I think that it's not, although it's a state decision, there has to be a lot of communication back and forth. The other issue I just touch on, because it came up earlier, is public transit. We are woefully underfunded as far as I'm concerned about public transit from a state level. So Ohio, depending on how you measure it, per capita is around 46th or 47th in public transit funding in the United States when it comes to state funds. Yes, we have a lot of local funding, but I think those of you in Cuyahoga County with, I think it's the 1% sales tax, We have a 0.5% in Summit County, which we raised from 0.25% in '08. I think the well is pretty dry on continuing to increase those local taxes, sales taxes that go into public transit. So I do think the state could do more on public transit. And it's not necessarily me saying that the state has to fund it by itself, but I think the state could be a better partner in helping, especially the needs of urban areas. And I hope that I know those conversations are going on, and I hope to see that change.
And Chris, not to be accused, not to be accused of completely deflecting that question. Certainly the state, particularly ODOT, has a tough job. As difficult as we think transportation decisions are for our region, they have to do it for the entire state. And the state is very diverse. We have 3 mega cities or mega regions in the state. We have Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati. Then we have the next tier cities, Akron, Dayton, Youngstown. Then you have tremendous amount of suburbia and rural agricultural. So it's a very difficult state to be able to develop policies or governing laws relative to transportation that would fit the entire state. So they've got a tough job there. That being said, to add on to what Jason was saying with public transportation, when I worked in Chicago for the Regional Transportation Authority, it was a much easier relationship to the state in terms of funding because we were Chicago. We were the largest region. We were 80% of the economic engine of the state. That couldn't be ignored. We probably need to do a better job at the various levels, whether they're urban, whether they're rural, whether they're suburban, of aggregating the needs and looking at how we can coexist relative to funding in a more practical way. So in addition to what Jason is saying about them doing more, what I've asked them specifically is to do what Illinois does. For every dollar that's raised locally, the state should come up with $1 for public transit. That way you're not punishing communities like the Cuyahoga folks who have already put up 1%, so they're already generating their own. And for those that don't want public transit, that's fine. Those that want it then can actually grow to support or complement what their local folks are doing. The other thing that I would change, Chris, and I think you and I probably have talked about this, and this is, I believe, something that the state legislature probably has to do, and that relates to how do roads get maintained. And state routes in the incorporated areas are not maintained by ODOT or the state. The municipalities have to maintain them. So the state will maintain them in the unincorporated or the rural areas, but not the incorporated areas. That's tough for the incorporated areas to come up with the funding to deal with that. So I would look to the state legislature to look at that issue to better address the concerns, particularly because if you look at all of the economic activity in the state of Ohio, much of it is happening, the majority of it is happening in the incorporated or the urban areas. So I would look to that. And then the issue, I would probably be remiss if I didn't suggest that there has to be a way for older regions like ours, Northeast Ohio, that are not growing, and we do not need capacity projects to be able to request large swaths of funding for maintenance of our existing roadways. We currently don't have a funding source to go to. We have the regular funds that we are allocated and some small pots of money here or there. But if I want a capacity project, if I want to go ask for an opportunity corridor for $300 million, there's a place for me to go ask for $300 million to build something new, or the Portsmouth bypass for $600 million. But if I want $300 million to maintain the existing network of roads that we've invested in over the last 50 years, there's nowhere for me to go for that. I would change that.
That's it. Good.
Hello, thank you for your nice talk. So you've talked today about how transportation is a link from individuals to employment. and also that you're planning for the future state. So could you talk about public-private partnerships to link individuals to future, like jobs of the future? So, looking how employment is sort of transitioning more towards healthcare and these sort of sectors, what partnerships are there that, industries can work with public transit agencies?
Yeah, public-private partnerships are always good. I mean, to say that market forces need to be partnered with government or regulatory forces, absolutely. There is no such thing as a truly capitalistic society. It all has to have some support and regulation to it. So partnerships are ideal. It becomes a matter of what are those partnerships, and are they a formal partnership or an informal partnership or both? The transportation system should support private development and growth, but it should be done in such a way that it works in tandem and not perhaps one leading the other or done in a disaggregate or disorganized way. The other thing I'll say with public-private partnerships is it has to be thought of in how do you maximize the benefit for the region, and at what stage of development does one or the other get involved. And in terms of the formal public-private partnerships, I think it's great to involve the private sector in investing in transportation, such as different kinds of lease arrangements and buy arrangements. But at the end of the day, it's still public money that's going to be spent. Right. So you evaluate those public-private partnerships in a way that maximizes the return on investment, just like you should any other decision.
And I'll approach that from a slightly different direction, but with my new gig as planning director, one of the things that I'm really interested in doing in Akron is growing our city's population. And I think too many cities in our region, and when I say region, I'm talking the whole Great Lakes, Pennsylvania, New York, have just resigned themselves to their fate of, we're always going to keep losing people. Is that an easy problem to take on? I'm probably nuts for even trying to think about it, but I think we have to figure out a way to grow our population back in the city of Akron. So we had 290,000, we're at 198,000 today. I think we have a lot of opportunities working with the private sector, because the private sector is what builds things, specifically homes and commercial structures. There are a lot of pieces of the puzzle we can look at. The reason I mentioned that on a transit question is just, if we can restore and rebuild our cities and our urban spaces, all of a sudden we don't have to spend money on sending that bus line 45 minutes out to a freeway interchange somewhere, especially when the people who need those jobs are right there in our community. So I'm very much focused. There's been great work that Jim Rokakis has done at Thriving Communities with looking at the vacant property. They did a survey for the city of Akron, 90,000 residential parcels. They went parcel by parcel with iPads, evaluated all of them. I think if we get smart about how we plan on redeveloping, we can create a lot of demand in our city and not have to have all those transportation costs associated with moving people here, there, and everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. I was just a question, how important and how to a successful planning is a viable regional government? Which I thought you alluded to a little bit when you said the Cuyahoga and Portage ought to get together. So do you think we can do all of this without a really significantly regional government?
Yeah, I don't think we've ever really talked about a regional government per se. In a lot of work that both Jason and I have done with 12 counties, being Akron, Canton, Cleveland, and Youngstown, I don't think a formal structure is what's needed. What's needed is a sense of cooperation and collaboration, and a sense of an identity that is something we can all be part of. It's really putting the systems and the networks in place to get things done for the betterment of the region. I don't think another layer of government is what we're talking about or needing.
I'd echo that, and I would say regional collaboration we could do a lot more of and do a lot better. Regional government, it's never going to happen. On top of that, I think when you look at things in our society, everything that's big is tending to get smaller. I think that means that I think over time, even our cities and urban areas may start contracting because I really, as I mentioned earlier, I don't believe we can pay for all this stuff. And we're only one recession or depression away from really not being able to pay for all of it. So I actually think the scale and scope of needs is going to probably shrink over time. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be collaborating regionally. I think we will eventually in parts of Ohio see mergers of local governments that's different than a regional government. But there are communities that just can't afford to pay for anything that they have anymore. And by pooling their resources, they might be able to, or they'll de-incorporate and become part of the state and become the county's problem.
You know, Jason, I'm going to stop right there because you just opened a whole bag that we could do a whole
Next time.
a whole nother forum on. So today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a panel discussion of the future of transportation here in Northeast Ohio. I want to thank our panelists, Grace and Jason, for being here, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, Grace.